hit record on this. So we should be recording now. Welcome everybody to the call today. I'm Emily Homan. I'm the Fire Learning Network Manager for the Nature Conservancy. And sorry, was there a question there? I think we're just getting some feedback. If everyone could please mute their microphones, that would really help the background noise. Very much appreciated, thank you. Okay, so joining us today is Mike Caggiano with the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute. And Mike, would you mind introducing any of your co-collaborators as well?
Yeah, that'd be great. So I had asked Chris O'Connor to join the call. He's one of my colleagues at U.S. Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station, who's done a lot of work with pods and is doing a lot of work with pods. And I thought his participation on the call would help, and I think he has a number of insights that he could share with the group.
Excellent. Welcome, Chris, as well. And then since we have
I'm not sure if he's on the call quite yet, but he should be joining us fairly soon.
I think I see his name in the participant.
He is on the call.
Are you there, Kit?
Yeah.
Yes, just had myself muted. Thanks.
Awesome. Welcome. All right, since we do have a relatively small group today, I'd love to go around and do some introductions. If you could give your name and what landscape you're located in or what part of the country, that would be fantastic. And I am going to start at the top of the list here with Beth Buchanan.
Hey, am I on mute?
Yep, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, I'm Beth Buchanan. I co-lead the Southern Blue Ridge Fire Learning Network with Margaret Bucher of TNC in North Carolina. I am located in Virginia, and our network spans the Southern Appalachian Mountains in Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And as soon as I figure out how to mute myself, I will do that.
Thanks, Beth, and welcome. Kit, is there anything else you would like to say as an introduction? You're next on the list.
Sure. So I'm Kit O'Connor. I'm an ecologist with the Rocky Mountain Research Station Wildfire Risk Management Science Team. And our kind of purview is over the last 15 years or so to be developing a lot of the foundational products that Mike is going to talk about today. And then we've been pushing forward on certain components as we have capacity. And then Mike and his collaborators at CFRI have been picking up other components and moving them forward in kind of a united front to try and bring together as many of these moving parts as possible to push forward in strategic fire planning.
Excellent. Welcome, Kit. Lindsay, you're next on the list. Lindsay Curtin.
Hi, everybody. I'm Lindsay Curtin. I'm the fire ecologist on the George Washington and Jefferson National Forests, and we're part of the Central Appalachians FLN. And that's
Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Carrie Metlin. We're just doing introductions. If you could introduce yourself, please.
Nature Conservancy in Ashland, Oregon. Really interested in this pod work, and I really enjoyed being at the
Oh, Carrie, I think you broke out there a little bit. Okay, sorry about that, Carrie. Your audio broke out, but we did get part of your introduction there. Thanks. If you want to just put in the chat box, that would be great. Nicole Simmons, if you could introduce yourself and the partners who are with you.
Hi everyone, I'm Nicole Simmons. I work in the mountains of Virginia for the Nature Conservancy, and I'm a part of the Central Appalachians Fire Learning Network. I have several colleagues here gathered around today. We are working on some wildfire response planning with the George Washington Jefferson National Forest. We have Vishal, John Monk here. They're with the George Washington Jefferson National Forest, and Laurel is also here with us.
Excellent.
Hi,
Welcome to everyone.
everybody.
Hello. All right, Liz Rank is next on the list, and she let me know she does not have a mic set. So Liz is our Fire Learning Network Information Manager. Liz, I hope I got your title right there. Liz is fantastic. She's the one who puts out the networker and does so much of our wonderful maps and information work. Could not do it without her, and she sits in Salt Lake City. Meg Matanis, you're next on the list.
Hello, my name is Meg Matonis, and I work with the Forest Stewards Guild, and I'm based in Loveland, Colorado, and I'm with the Intermountain West office, and we are primarily working in Colorado, but the Guild has locations across the country and are doing work with a lot of the different FLN partners on this call.
Fantastic, welcome. M. Ward, is that Matthew Ward?
Yes, ma'am. Hello, everybody. This is Matthew Ward. I work for the Nature Conservancy in East Idaho.
Awesome, thank you, and welcome, Matthew. All right, Rich Walters.
Good afternoon, everybody. Rich Walters. I work for the Nature Conservancy in Nebraska, where the Great Plains work.
Welcome, Rich. And William Anderson.
Hey everybody, it's actually McCree Anderson. I work for the Nature Conservancy. I'm in Arkansas and I oversee the South Central Fire Learning Network with partners from the Ozark and Ouachita National Forests.
Excellent, thanks McCree, I knew that. Did I miss anybody who's joined us since we started introductions?
Yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead if I missed anyone. Okay, well, if your audio is just not working, please put introduction in the chat box if you have access to that. So Mike, I think we're all set for you to go ahead and take it away.
Okay, that sounds great. Thanks for handling the introductions, Emily. Okay, let's see if I can get the PowerPoint to work. Okay, perfect. So we have a fairly short presentation planned. Here you see the overview. We're just going to quickly discuss what pods are. We'll talk a little bit about developing pods collaboratively in cross-boundary settings. We'll talk about how pods are being used, because I think providing examples of how pods are being used really illustrates what's possible and what is likely. And we'll talk about some lessons learned and some next steps. I've been involved in helping several landscapes and national forests implement and develop pods. And Kit O'Connor has helped a number of other landscapes with their pods, and we're starting to kind of understand what works well, what isn't working well, starting to collect and distill some of those best management practices. We'll talk about some next steps. We're going to focus on several landscapes in particular, because I think the specific next steps on specific landscapes really offers some insight. And then, since we have a small group, I was hoping we could have a more active back and forth discussion, especially since the pods have in the past really had a U.S. Forest Service centric focus. And since this is a Nature Conservancy FLN centered audience, I think there's a number of opportunities to get the FLNs on board, kind of more of that interagency, more of that cross-boundary flavor, and I think that focus requires a unique approach. Emily had sent out or Emily had emailed or spoken with several of you, and we got a few questions in return. So I spent a little time thinking through how best to answer some of those questions, and those are in the presentation, and I think that others in the audience have additional questions so they might not have written down and provided earlier. So we'll provide some time, and we can talk about that at the end. I think Kit O'Connor and the folks in Oregon who've been doing a lot of spatial fire planning work are going to both have questions and provide insights that will be helpful to the rest of us. And before I get going on the presentation, I just want to acknowledge that a lot of the concepts, the slides, the figures in the presentation are coming from lots of other people. This is not just my work. There's been a large group of researchers, academics, managers, and practitioners who have all contributed to this developing framework. So I'll get into that PODS 101, and then we'll go from there. Overall, PODS, which stands for Potential Operational Delineations, is part of strategic wildfire planning. It's one of several frameworks. I think those of us on the call are probably familiar with the quantitative risk assessments, which model fire behavior, fire probability, and how different resources and assets are likely to respond to fire. What we talk about when we mention PODS are that PODS link a network of the most effective control locations on the landscape into small, operationally relevant units. We support that work, or that work it leverages expert knowledge, and it leverages some fire modeling products which help support identifying where those locations are on the landscape. One of the things that I'll note here is that fires don't know jurisdictional boundaries, and neither do the control opportunities. So it's very important when we identify where these pods are, we're not beholden to land ownership, unless it makes sense. Often, and as you'll see in some of the examples here, the pod framework is implemented in conjunction with those wildfire risk assessments. And when we combine the pods and the quantitative risk assessments, we can create what are termed strategic response zones, which start to articulate a likely fire response based on where the pod boundaries are and how the resources and assets in the pods are likely to respond to wildfire. These pods, along with these other frameworks, can inform fire response across the whole range. So this is not only to identify where we want to use fire for ecological objectives. This is equally relevant for those full suppression fires where we want to suppress those fires as quickly as possible, either because values are threatened or firefighter exposure. And this pod framework just tells us where on the landscape is likely to be the most effective spot if we're taking indirect response strategies. And then lastly, the utility of this pod framework is in the fact that it helps integrate land management objectives into fire response. It helps and then since it integrates land management and fire response, it can really be an effective planning tool and a communication tool, both for incident planning and communication, as well as the pre-planning efforts that happen well before the smoke is in the air. So that's my several-minute overview of what pods are. I think that's mostly a review for most of us on the call, but if you could just use the chat box and let us know if that was a review and we're good to go on to the next, or if some of this is still brand new, I can take just a little more time and we can dive into the details.
Watching the chat box here, Mike. I don't have any comments yet.
Yeah, I can see the chat box as well now.
Awesome.
So we can have the awkward silence for a minute or two, and we'll see if people can type.
And if folks are at all just on a phone and are not viewing on a computer screen, go ahead and just speak up.
All right, it looks like the responses are starting to flow in here. And like I thought, it seems like everyone or most everyone is good to go. And that was largely a review, which works. And so we'll move on. Just to kind of start, and again, this slide is probably review as well, but we use these different fire modeling products, the Suppression Difficulty Index, Potential Control Line, Atlas, and some reference letters, and we combine that with expert knowledge and that local expertise, and that's how we get the pod network. So this is the technical process for creating pods. We end up with these pods usually as black magic markers on big maps, and then we take those lines and we put them into a GIS, and that's how they can become the planning tool and the communication tool. And we got a question here. In what context are you getting any pushback on pods? That is a great question. And I'm gonna save that one until the end. I think there are several areas where we tend to see that, and we'll address that here in a little bit. Okay, so the collaborative process of developing pods looks like this. It's, you know, getting a bunch of people in a room, explaining what strategic strategic wildfire planning is, how the risk assessments worked, and then it's getting around on those maps, and it's sketching out where those pod boundaries are, where those opportunities are. It's this sort of stuff that kind of fosters communication. It's these sorts of meetings where, yeah, you have to think through who should be in the room. We want to rely on local expertise for where those pod boundaries are, and normally that comes from those experienced firefighters and fire managers. But there's also a wide range of stakeholders who are interested in this. So what pods, in essence, is accomplishing is we're getting that information out of the heads of the firefighters who are tasked with managing fires, and we're getting that information onto a map so the rest of us understand the strategies and tactics that are likely to be used. And those stakeholders who we want at the meetings, they might include the resource specialists who have in-depth knowledge of habitat or wildlife biology, or the hydrology of the system, who can provide information on where the risks are, where the hazards are. And then we're also getting people in the room who just want to know that land managers and these large landscape collaboratives are taking thoughtful and strategic approaches. You can think of that as a county as a county manager or a county commissioner who might not have the in-depth knowledge or even the bandwidth to actively engage in fire planning, but they want to know that the experts in the room are doing that. So you have these different audiences, those who help make the lines on the map, those who contribute some of the data that we can use to map the values at risk, those who just want to know that those sorts of activities are being done in a thoughtful way. So there's kind of multiple collaborative processes that are at place here. So what we have here on this slide is just a few examples. One from the Tonto National Forest on the right, and then on the left is a combination of the Carson and the Santa Fe National Forest. And these you can see on the right, we have 3 fires that were used. They're labeled A, B, and C. On the left figure, they're in pink, so not quite the same format, but we can see that these are the fires that are happening on multiple landscapes that are starting to use pods. Sometimes these fires match the pod boundaries exactly, like you see on the right there and that bottom figure. Other times, like you see on the figure on the left, but the fires themselves are much smaller than the pods. And while the fire managers sometimes use those pre-identified boundaries as the boundary of the fire itself, sometimes it doesn't line up like that. And in those cases, the pods are still useful because they're used as a planning tool and as a communication tool. And we'll get into that here. What we see here on this slide are some excerpts from a report that we are writing up. And this is on how pods were used in northern New Mexico in the 2019 fire season. Like we showed on that last slide, the fires themselves only partially matched up with the physical pod boundaries. But what each of these 4 fires shows is how the collaborative process is, or in some cases, is not working. On the first fire, you can see that they use the pod boundaries on a few sides of the fire, but on the southern side, the fire had potential to cross over onto Pueblo land, and since the agencies were not able to talk to one another in the preseason in order to discuss the possibility of this happening, the decision was made to not let the fire cross onto Pueblo lands. Anytime you get multiple ownerships involved, it complicates the incident with who's in charge, who's paying, that sort of stuff. On the second and third fire there, the Cuerva fire, we spoke to the district ranger afterwards, and they were able to use pods as a communication tool. They took the pod maps, or they took the fire incident maps with their pods to the local stakeholders and the affected communities, and they were able to explain the where, the why, and the how of how they're managing this fire for such and such objectives. And then not only were pods used in the discussions with the local community, they were used in discussions with the firefighters on the ground and with the regional leadership, right? So everyone is talking about pods. So pods creates that common operating picture that is uniting all the communication. And then on the last fire here, the Mole fire, that one was really interesting as well, and is a really great example of the pre-planning and the pre-season meetings interagency. And so when the fire was reported, there were no local national forest resources available. And so the BLM was asked to go out and respond and suppress the fire. When the BLM responded and sized up the fire, they determined that, hey, this fire is probably achieving some good ecological objectives in order to accomplish some restoration and some fuel reduction, and it's in a green pod. And so the discussions that occurred, or through those discussions, the decision was made to manage that fire instead of suppressing it. And the only reason that happened is because the Forest Service had shared their pod data and the strategic response zones with the BLM. So all of the BLM staff and the BLM fire engines had those pod maps with them. And so that just shows that, or rather, the lesson learned there is, this fire was managed because that information was shared in the preseason. So that's just a great example of that interagency decision making. So I can move on to some of the lessons learned here, but I suppose I'll ask if anyone has any questions, and if you want to write in the chat box, I can take a pause, and we can go from there. Okay, so what we're finding is the pods are being used as a operational tool, right? It's being a communication tool for fire operations in order to align the communication and the shared understanding. And this is happening with kind of multiple stakeholders in between the line officers and the fire crews, the line officers and the regional leadership, the resource specialists, and the affected stakeholders. Now, while it's easy to pull examples from that operational context and that incident context, we're also seeing pods being used as a planning tool. We're seeing pods integrate with land management plans. We're seeing them intersect and integrate with all lands risk assessments. They're starting to be used to help plan and prioritize fuel treatments, both on national forest and adjacent private lands or lands under other management. We're seeing them being integrated into community wildfire protection plans. And like that example I just provided, we're seeing pods being integrated into that interagency pre-season planning. And so some of the lessons learned here are, pods in essence are just an operationally relevant container. So we can start to summarize any sort of spatial data that overlays with that. What we're seeing is that the collaborative process of developing and utilizing these pods is just as important as the information products that are being used. One of the other lessons learned is, this is a iterative process. It takes time to wrap your head around this. It takes time to develop pods for one land ownership. And if you have a landscape with multiple landowners or a complex land ownership, it's going to take a lot of time. It's hard to get all the right people in the same room at the same time, but you can take a iterative approach where one land management agency might take the lead and develop pods on their land, and then maybe the next year or the next season, the adjacent land management agency kind of gets on board and says, hey, we think this is a good idea. We saw how you used this last year, and so you can extend the pod network afterwards. And that makes sense, because even those lines aren't static. As fires happen, as fuel treatments happen, as roads are either commissioned or 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 decommissioned, those pod networks are going to change. And then one of the other kind of lessons learned is as you start to draw your pods and you realize that you're drawing a pod on someone else's land, that creates a good catalyst for having the discussion with that affected entity, either the landowner, the land manager, or the agency who's responsible for fire response there. Sometimes that's all the same entity, and in many cases, it's not. And so having those discussions are the most important part of this whole process. The discussions about why the pod boundary is where it is, and then the follow-up discussion of what are the management objectives on one side of the fence, and how do they align with the management objectives on the other side. And that's just a few of the lessons learned that I've started to hone in on. I'm wondering if Kit has any additional suggestions at this point.
Mike,
and you might be on mute still. Kit. Yep, we got you now.
Okay. Actually, I think you've touched on most of the lessons learned components that we've seen so far. I think one of the other big takeaways is that every landscape is different. And so we've seen examples of certain processes working, starting as kind of a central facilitator, a central catalyst, and then expanding outward. We've also seen more of a big tent approach where we attempt to bring everybody into the room at square one and knock out a very large area, very complex ownership all at once. In terms of other things to think about, the dynamism of the risk profile is also really important. So understanding that while the pod boundaries themselves can change at some level, the best available suppression opportunities or engagement opportunities are relatively static, but as Mike alluded to, adding roads or creating fuel breaks can actually help create smaller pods within a pod. So you can actually start to subdivide your larger pods. But that risk profile can change significantly both throughout the fire season, depending on what PL level you're at and what resources are available and the fire weather conditions and those types of things. But also after a fire or after those fuel treatments, you can actually dramatically alter potential fire behavior. And so you can shift a pod that would have been classified as, say, a restore zone or even a protect zone into kind of the next class down. So you could bring a restore zone into a maintain zone or a protect zone into a restore zone by doing significant fuel treatments, either by using wildfire, prescribed burning, or active management treatments. So those are just some examples kind of to think about. And I think a huge part of the importance of getting these ideas out prior to fire season is bringing in all the nuance. Because it's very easy to push back against this process if you think it's overly simplified and if you think that someone's doing all the homework for you and making decisions for you. And I think the number one thing to come out of this process is this is structured decision making where it's the people in the room who come up with the answer. There is no answer other than that. It's just information that's provided externally. So those are my multiple cents there.
And those are all good points. I appreciate you jumping in there, Kit. So I think the next slide, let's see, many states have full suppression mandate, also state law. How have you worked with state agencies who have suppression responsibilities? Yeah, so I think that question, Emily, that was the exact context of previous question on where are we getting the pushback on pods. Like I said before, you're going to have to wait until the end, because I think that's one of the more interesting questions, and I think that by going through the rest of the presentation, we'll start to kind of wrap our heads around that. So you'll have to wait. I'm going to keep everyone in suspense just a little bit longer. Here's just a few of the quotes that are, here's some of the feedback that we're starting to see with this process. And I highlighted some quotes here that speak to the collaborative nature, or that kind of how to create that shared understanding in between individuals and organizations who might not see eye to eye. And so, again, it's the idea that since this isn't stopping at the boundaries, that's what complicates this process, and that's also what makes this process stronger. Again, like Kit said, it's that structured decision making. And I apologize, because you're never supposed to put this much text on one slide, but I thought these quotes were helpful and really start to illustrate the nuance that's associated with this approach. And again, by getting everyone in the room and providing opportunity for feedback and critique and input, it's the discussions that happen that really have all the value. And so, yeah, sometimes you'll have some awkward discussions on what the response should be, where it should be, how it should happen, but it's better to have those in the preseason when there's not smoke in the air. As soon as there's smoke in the air, you're time constrained and the pressure's on, and the people who normally have a cool head on their shoulders all of a sudden are screaming mad. And it's important to have these conversations in the preseason, and pods really complements all the existing pre-planning work that people are already doing. So here are some of the next steps that both are happening in the New Mexico landscape, where some of this work is happening, and then I'll get to that block on the right, which are more the next steps for myself and the other folks like Kit, who are moving this process along. We started this process in northern New Mexico, kind of mostly Forest Service centric, but we had some really good input from the Nature Conservancy, who provided their all-lands risk assessment. We had some participation from the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Park Service, but you know, there were several entities who were not at the table. So next week we're having a workshop with the Bureau of Land Management. The Forest Service is going to be there. We're also getting several of the tribes to attend, hopefully. And then we're also getting New Mexico State Forestry. That's the state organization who's in charge of land management and fire suppression on private land. And this actually speaks to your question earlier, Emily, on what happens when you're trying to engage an organization who has a suppression mandate. And we're starting to get them at the table with New Mexico State Forestry in particular. there was a change in leadership, and there's a change in mindset, which is certainly helping. We can talk about that a little more here in a little bit, but the other things that we're starting to see in terms of next steps on that landscape is validating those pod lines, kind of making sure they're in good shape. We're creating maps that will go in all of the fire engines and all of the engine bays, and just starting to improve that line classification, because it's important to know under what conditions those lines, under what conditions we think those lines are going to be effective, and then where might we want to strengthen those lines in the preseason in order to make sure they're more effective if and when a wildfire happens. And then some of the work that we're doing on the R&D side of the fence is improving the model through incorporating some machine learning algorithms, and then just continuing to develop some information products that that managers will find useful. And we're also doing some third-party evaluations in order to see how pods, or if and how pods are influencing the decision-making process. It's important to have that third party because we don't want to bias the results. And what I really like about working with the group of researchers, that Kit was explaining earlier, is that commitment to actually making a difference. It's one thing to write a research paper and throw that information out there, but with this group in particular, the commitment to actually wanting to see real change on the ground is real refreshing, and that's what keeps me going. Yes, and I will explain the meaning of the different polygons here, and then we'll jump back to that climate change question later on. So what we're seeing on this slide are the pod network, and what Kit was explaining earlier is that when we combine the pod network with the quantitative risk assessment, we start to understand what we're calling the conditional or the expected net value change. So how the resources in any one pod are going to respond to wildfire of varying intensities. You can think of that as a ponderosa pine forest, which might improve if you reduced a low severity wildfire, more of that understory burn, or that same forest would have a negative net value change if it experienced a crown fire. And so once we understand how the resources in any pod will respond to fires of different magnitude, we can start to quantify, or start to classify rather, what firefighting response might look like in any pod. So what we're seeing here on this map are the green pods are where we think the landscape and the resources would benefit from seeing a wildfire, and the red areas are, and someone said the Tano slide included the actual descriptions. Yes, so we'll kind of switch back to this, but the concept is still the same. So the green areas are what we call a maintain. So that's where we want fire, and the majority of resources would benefit from fire under a wide range of conditions. The protect pods in red are areas such as the wildland urban interface, where those assets in those pods are not going to want fire under a wide range of conditions. So those homes are going to have high risk if there's fire there, and that's where we generally want to suppress fire as quickly as possible. And then the yellow pods are the in between, what we're calling the restore pods. So that's where we may or may not want fire, all depending on the conditions. But under more moderate weather, under more moderate fire behavior, we expect that those pods would experience a net benefit. And hopefully that clarified that question on different meanings of the polygons. And I'll move back to where I was, and we're still monitoring the chat box. So if that was not sufficient, just let me know, and we'll jump back in there. Okay, so here's where we left off. So here's just a few of the products in the pipeline. I already mentioned that third-party review that's being undertaken by the Public Land Policy Group, a small research group here at Colorado State University. And on the figures that we're looking at here are Pod Atlas and some of the products that would appear in the Pod Atlas, where once we have the landscapes designated into pods, we can start to identify the hazards and the values at risk in each pod. These are largely the same features that are included in the quantitative risk assessments, and that help us designate the strategic response zones, but sometimes it's important to see the data inputs instead of just the final output. And then what we see on the right here, the 12-part figure, is we took a look at one pod and the type of fire behavior that we would see in that pod under 3 different wind conditions and 4 different fuel moistures. So in the top left there, we have high moisture and low wind, and we're seeing a lot of low intensity fire behavior with low flame lengths. As you move over to the right, and as you move downward, you start to see the fire behavior profile changes to more higher intensity fire. So we can start to use figures like this in order to say, okay, in a particular pod, these are the conditions where we'd expect a positive net value change, and these are the conditions where we would expect a more negative net value change. So these are the types of products that we're starting to develop, and we're starting to roll out to managers, and we're getting some feedback, and just want to make the most useful products that we can. And let's see. So for the lucky folks in the room who managed to send the questions early, I started to sketch out my take on one of the answers. One of those questions was, who should be involved with pre-fire planning? And my gut answer is, of course, everyone. That's not reality, though. I think we've discussed the all aboard from the start versus the iterative approach. We've discussed the idea that while those local firefighters can tell us where the pod boundaries are, other stakeholders have a lot to offer as well. Some want to be kept in the process from the very start. Others just want to know this process is happening, and they're happy to be on the periphery. And then, like Kit mentioned earlier, it's that recognition that we all work in unique landscapes. So what that land ownership pattern looks like, what who has what resources, who has what interests, all drive who should be at the table. It is those land managers, though, across the whole spectrum. It is the fire managers across the whole spectrum. It is the public officials. It is the communities who are likely to be affected. It is the stakeholders. And I apologize if that's a cop-out answer, but it's the best I got for you. Yep. And so one of the questions that we got was, you want to jump in?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I want to jump in on that too, because I think, Carrie, that was a really good question. And that's still something that we grapple with constantly. One of the things that we found, kind of the two primary groups are people who know about fire and how to do something with fire, and people who know what's affected by fire. And all of the things that are being actively managed for across the landscape, both on public and private lands, and how those things are either ecologically or structurally or physically going to be affected by the most likely fire behavior that thing is going to experience. So that's the two broad groups if we want to include. Over all of that, the decision makers are a critical group to have on board. The people who are going to have to stand behind whatever this product is and sell it to whoever needs to buy it, basically. And so what we found is if we just have fire managers helping to draw those pods, but we don't have the leadership involved, then those pods never get adopted because the leadership hasn't signed off on them. And that could be because typically the conversations aren't a fire staff going to a mayor of a city. It's going to be the forest supervisor, or it's even going to be a regional forester going to the state forester saying, hey, this is what we're going to do. And so we need to have that leadership buy-in. That's critical. And so there are kind of multiple scales that this functions under. Ideally, when we're drawing those pods, it's everybody who knows anything about fire. So it's municipal fire departments, it's agency fire responders, and it's federal fire responders, kind of all at the table because they tend to all think the same way. They understand how fire behaves. They tend to come to agreement pretty quickly, and it really facilitates that process. And then when those individual groups have to go back to say the agency mission or whatever organization they're representing, they can bring that fire reality picture along saying, yes, ideally, we are going to protect these timberlands from fire, but we won't have an opportunity to do it unless we go to these locations. And so it really starts to ground those difficult conversations in the preseason. So I'll leave it at that.
Oh, well, and thanks for jumping in there, Kit. I think those are all good points. The next question I attempted to answer, and again, I probably didn't really do a good job, but strategies for engaging tribes. I think first and foremost, we need to recognize that any sort of cross-boundary work is hard and complicates the process. I, in my career, have never really had a lot of work, never really had a lot of luck working across tribal boundaries. There is that mistrust. Sometimes there's incompatible government structures. But again, I know there's folks on the call from all parts of the country. So what that tribal situation looks like in one part of the world is completely different than what it might look like in another part of the world. I think we need to rely on those personal contacts and communication, and when there is interest and when there is a local champion, we need to really embrace that. And then maybe there's opportunities here to embrace the cultural burning or historical burning practices that align well with pods. And I'm just reading a question real fast. Okay. So yeah, that's pretty much the end of the presentation. There have been a few questions in the chat box, so I'll start to answer a few of those, and maybe Kit can jump in and answer a few of those as well. And the rest of you, if you have any additional questions you haven't yet thrown out, this is your chance. One of the questions that was mentioned earlier was about how to engage with an organization like say Forest Service, who might not have a might have more of a suppression mandate. And you know, like I mentioned earlier, this pod framework is not only for reintroducing fire and managing fire for ecological objectives. It works equally well when you do have a full suppression mandate and you just need to determine the best spot on the landscape in order to suppress that fire. Under the situation where you have extreme fire behavior and you're not able to attack that fire with direct attack, so kind of where to fall back to those indirect attack strategies. You know, my answer there is, you know, every fire is suppressed eventually, and the authority is often delegated to the land managers and the fire managers, and they get to decide when and where and how to suppress these fires. The pod framework and the strategic response zones help articulate the where and the how. And, you know, as land managers and as fire managers, we're also increasingly being asked the why. Why are you doing what you're doing? And, you know, there's numerous considerations there. You know, those land management objectives, the values at risk, firefighter and public safety, ecological impacts, what resources are available and at your, what resources are available, and then the social and the political. So I think this process helps us think through the why. But, you know, even if you're a full suppression entity, you still need to decide the when, the where, and the how. And this framework simply provides you just one more tool. You know, you're going to have to fall back to the next road or the next ridgeline sometimes. And it's nice to know where that is. It's not the next ridge, it's the best ridge. You know, we don't want to waste money. We don't want to expose our firefighters, you know, whether that's the bulldozer operator who needs to punch a line up a ridge, or whether that's a pilot who needs to do a drop. You know, we don't want to unnecessarily expose them if the work they're doing isn't going to be effective. And this pod framework just helps us understand where and when we can be most effective in suppressing those wildfires. And so that's my answer to the full suppression folks who might that's kind of where we find the most amount of pushback. We also get some pushback of, well, if we need to suppress a fire and we're doing that on private land, we need agreements in place with all the landowners. And I don't even know if that's true. You might want agreements in place, and it certainly complicates the cost accounting if you have options. But yeah, those are just things to think about, I guess. I don't know if you want to jump in at all, Kit, and either give a better answer for the question I tried to answer, or take one of the other ones in the chat.
So I'm not going to provide any better answers. I will add some additional detail if people have some questions on that. Would it be possible for me to do a quick screen share so we can have a kind of a conversation around an image, potentially? I'm going to...
Yeah, absolutely.
Share.
If
okay.
Mike stops sharing, down at the bottom of your screen, there should be a button that says share. And if you just hit that, it'll give you select the right window.
Okay. Share. And then I'm going to throw this up there. So the question, can you all see this image?
Yep, we sure can.
Challenges of implementation. So it's a very good question about how do you engage private owners, how do you engage Department of Natural Resources, other stakeholders who have very different mandates in terms of what they can and cannot do with fire, or what they intend or do not intend to do with fire. And one of the things that we like to use to help people kind of get around a common strategy is some of these analytical tools that Mike referenced. This is an example of one of those tools. It's called the Potential Control Locations Atlas. The colors on here are very different from the risk colors. And you'll see in the key over here on the right, the upper right-hand corner, what we're really looking at is the historical control line effectiveness. So this is basically saying that something that's red is very unlikely that you can almost hands down, you will not stop a fire under most conditions in those red zones. It's just not an appropriate place to safely or effectively put people. But as you start to move towards those cooler colors, your probability of success goes way up. And the challenge on a landscape like this is actually just about 20 miles south of where I'm standing right now in Missoula. So Missoula is kind of at the top of the map right there in Montana. And this is the Bitterroot Valley. And what you're seeing here is these yellow lines on the right and left of the image. That is the Forest Service boundary with private land. And what you're seeing is the Forest Service boundary is about, well, 95% of it is a place that would be extremely ineffective at stopping a fire. And so just by showing an unbiased product like this that actually just relies on the history of how fire behaves on this landscape and how fire gets modeled on this landscape, we can start to have conversations around, okay, in our current condition, we cannot expect the Forest Service to successfully contain fire on a lot of this landscape. What can we do in the off season to change that? Can we do fuel treatments? Can we do other things? Can we create access where it doesn't exist right now to start to change those colors? And also, before those actions get taken, where are those next best locations? So where can we start to function in the green or even the blue without putting a bunch of values at risk? So if we do have to come onto private land or state land or other non-federal ownership, where can we do that with the least amount of negative outcome? And so that just starts to bring in the fire reality as a conversation, understanding that in general, the DNR policy is full suppression all the time in Montana. And the reason for that is the defense of those forest resources against fire, because that is the education fund for the state. They don't want to burn up their education fund. That's a very good reason to keep fire out. But not every square inch of DNR land is forested. And so if we can identify those areas where it would be much safer and more effective to stop fire in a grassland, or even in a place where we'd be grazing animals anyway, or that fire behavior is expected to not be severe enough to actually harm that timber, then we can start to have conversations around that. understanding that we still have to respect the agency's mission differences, but we can also discuss those realities. And where we do have opportunities to stop fire at a Forest Service boundary, reinforce those, do that, and stop those fires before they ever get near the forest boundary, wherever possible. But it really just starts to kind of level the playing field in terms of a conversation. That's all I had to share. I'm gonna stop share on that. I don't know if that's helpful for people to kind of visualize.
That was great, Kit. Thank you. And what other partners, I'm curious, other than the state suppression agencies and agencies with a suppression mandate, has there been pushback on pods from? Are other federal agencies interested in adopting this, or are they shying away from it? And then also nonprofits, other jurisdictions that might be scattered in there as well.
Well, I think I can jump in here, Kit. I think the primary entities who need to be involved are the large land managers and those organizations who have fire suppression authority. We are the Department of Interior, so Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, and a few others. They do have a similar mandate. I didn't show it in this presentation, but the U.S. Forest Service, Washington office, all the way from the chief down, is mandating kind of spatial fire planning work, of which pods is one component. We are seeing the same mandate from the top down at the Department of Interior. That hasn't made it all the way down yet. We are starting to get some interest from the Bureau of Land Management and some national parks. Right now, it seems to be opportunistic, though, as those key individuals are hearing about this from, for instance, their Forest Service colleagues. We're getting some requests. There are other ways to do this sort of work. So I don't expect everyone is going to call either Kit or myself, but this is just that one tool that is fulfilling those national mandates. And I think I probably only answered half of your question, but now I forget what the other half was.
I was just wondering about non-federal or even non-agency partners who may be also interested in utilizing these tools.
I think that I think we're starting to see that a lot of times the non-agency folk are using this to, they want to know how fires are likely to be attacked, or what fire response is likely to look like, and using that information to help plan their fuel treatments. So we are seeing that some of the organizations that I work with, like water utilities, are investing in fuel treatments in order to protect their water supply, and they're starting to use these pod boundaries as one of the considerations with how they pick their projects and where they're located. Organizations like the New Mexico Nature Conservancy, and I think I mentioned this earlier, but they contributed spatial data and expertise in the form of their all lands risk assessment, which then went into this pod quantitative risk assessment process in order to inform the strategic response zones. So in that instance, it was the Nature Conservancy that did a lot of the fire modeling and spatial analysis, but that started as a interagency kind of multi-stakeholder all lands risk assessment. So you have the buy-in from multiple groups. I think this makes sense for those large landowners here in Colorado and New Mexico, we have ranches that are 10, 20, 30,000 acres. And so, this process makes sense at that sort of scale, especially when those acreages are adjacent to national forest. It starts to make a lot less sense if you're trying to talk to every landowner who has 5 or 10 acres. Those aren't the folks who are responsible for fire suppression, and the opportunities are limited. I think we are interested, though, in seeing who comes to the table. I think there's opportunities for state game and fish organizations to get involved, and that's the nice thing about taking the iterative approach that seems to be happening.
Great. Thanks, Mike. We're getting to the last 10 minutes here of our time, and we have 2 questions we haven't gotten to yet from Carrie and Darren. Has anyone started working on how to incorporate climate change into pod development?
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's happening. My default answer is wildfire adaptation is climate adaptation, as many of the places that I work, climate is most likely to manifest itself kind of most visually and most apparently through wildfire. How to incorporate other things into that, I'm at a loss for, although I definitely think that it's an area that is ripe for discussion, and would love to hear some ideas if you have any. And then Megan mentioned a fairly long chat here. So this is about old FMUs, old fire management units. And I'm not super familiar with exactly what you're talking about here, but it is familiar. And the reason it's familiar is because this pod process is not is not brand new. It's some new bells and whistles on a very old process. Since as long as people have been fighting fire and suppressing fire, those firefighters worth their weight have been thinking through the best places on the landscape in order to suppress those fires. What has changed is, instead of that longstanding practice of those firefighters identifying those areas and keeping them in their head, is we're getting this information out on a map. And so, this is just the next generation of that long-standing practice. A lot of those old FMUs followed jurisdictional boundaries or watershed boundaries instead of operationally relevant features. That's one of the key differences. But these pods, they look an awful lot like the burn blocks that we see in the southeast, and it's all those burn blocks are operationally relevant. They're surrounded by roads or a rocky ridgeline or the river. So we're just identifying those same features on the landscape that firefighters have been using for probably thousands of years.
Okay, well, we're just about 8 minutes out here from the end of our time together. So please definitely jump in if anyone has additional questions, or put them in the chat box. Mike, I was hoping that you and Kit could talk a little bit more about how folks are seeing pods as not only a tool for fire management, but also for fuels treatment prioritization.
I can definitely talk on that, and I'll share my screen again. It has my email on it, and my phone number. So if anyone wants to discuss anything further or has any more questions, please feel free to either send me an email or give me a call. Yeah, so I think that, yeah, so how pods are being used for fuel treatments. What pods do is they identify the most effective places on the landscape where we think we can stop fire. That does not necessarily mean they're going to be effective. In fact, most of these locations will require additional work in order to make them effective or have increased confidence in their effectiveness. So I think that is on the incident. That might look like a burnout operation. And before that incident, yeah, that's hazardous fuel reduction along the roadside. That's a roadside fuel break. So I think we can start to place fuel treatments along the pod boundaries, and then we have more confidence that, hey, these fuel treatments will also have increased likelihood of being effective when there's a fire, instead of what has been termed random acts of restoration, or the shotgun approach, where you look at a map of fuel treatments and there doesn't seem to have any rhyme or reason. I think you can also use these to plan fuel treatments inside of a pod when you know maybe the control line isn't very effective, or maybe you know that if a fire happens in that pod under a wide range of condition, you're going to have a negative impact. So if you're in one of those red pods, maybe you can do enough mitigation work, enough restoration work in order to change the color. So even if you do get a fire, you're not likely to have as negative a impact. Unfortunately, we have more examples of how pods are being used operationally, since there is the planning timeline and the NEPA and the funding aspects of mitigation work and the restoration work. We don't have a lot of examples of where fuel treatments are being placed either along pod boundaries or inside of pods, but I expect we're going to start to hear some of those stories, and hopefully success stories, within the next year or two.
Great, thank you, Mike. Any other questions out there? Okay, pretty quiet.
And before we wrap up, Emily, I just want to thank you and the FLN for giving me the opportunity to come and talk to your group and kind of share some of the stuff that I'm working on. I'm super excited about this stuff, and I hope you are too.
Yes, I definitely am, Mike. Really appreciate your time and Kit's time today. You know, working here in Colorado and New Mexico, my previous position being really a lot closer to the ground and working on this issue with local partners. It's really been a galvanizing issue, and something that some of the local collaborative groups have taken on as a project to assist the Forest Service and other partners with having these conversations. And of course, your work and Kit's work has been so important to getting the ball rolling on that. So I'm really excited to see where that heads in the next year or two, and continue seeing the lessons learned and how this rolls out successfully. So, and what the continued challenges are, because there are always challenges. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. All right, well, if there's no other questions, we will end it there. And thank you so much, Mike. Really appreciate it. And thank you as well, Kit, for being on. Really enjoyed hearing from both of you.
Right. Thanks again, Emily. Have a good day.
Yep, you too. And I will get the recording out as soon as possible to everyone. Thanks very much.
Oh, wonderful. Great. Thank you.